now.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this virtual conference on private investment in transmission in Africa. This is co-hosted by the African School of Regulation. I am the interim director of the African School of Regulation, also GridWorks and Hampton Andrews Kurtz, and in collaboration also with the African Development Bank and AFUR. So this is the fifth in a series of online 3-day conferences on important topics in regulation in Africa. The ASR uses these conferences to teach, of course, to promote good practices in regulation, but also to learn. We want to create the body of knowledge of what we will teach at the African School of Regulation by listening to experts in discussion about the topics and looking at the conclusions that they reach in these discussions. So what we do is to select a topic of interest in regulation in Africa, in this case, private investment in transmission, because we know that there is a problem. We know that, for instance, if we compare the number of kilometers of transmission lines in all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 38 countries, we see that Brazil has more kilometers on lines than 38 countries together. And we have uploaded a video of the person that has been the director of planning in Brazil, explaining what they have done to achieve this feat. So what we have done is to bring about 25 to 30 experts in the topic to discuss. No slides, except for some initial to set up the scene, the problem, to exchange opinions, look for the best regulatory approach. And we have organized the conference in 3 blocks. So I will share my screen to show you the program. So what we do is in the first day, we have the conference opening. This is what we are doing now. And we will have the words of Robert Lichens, Chief of Energy, Infrastructure and Services at the in UNECA. And then we will have 2 presentations, just the only slide presentations that we are going to have in the conference. First, the first one by Farai Kanonda, Regional Sector Manager of the African Development Bank, on the situation of the investment in transmission in Africa. And then I will talk about best international practices and current barriers to private investment in transmission in Africa. And then we will start with the interesting part, the panels. And for that, we will have this panel 1 on the current situation and experiences of interest in private investment in transmission in Africa. You have in the program the names of the moderators and the panelists for all the panels, and that will be the end for today. So the first day is devoted to present the current situation of the problem. The second day is devoted to look at the approaches, regulatory approaches, best practices to address the problem that we have presented in the first day, and we will have 2 panels. First one will be devoted to the independent transmission project approach. That will be somehow the topic that will be bringing together the different perspectives in during these 2 days. And then we have a second panel on regulatory modifications to remove barriers and facilitate investments. And that will be the second day. The third day is devoted to what is next, looking ahead, innovating together, finding what are the steps that should be done to implement the good ideas that we have discussed during the second day. And there will be an introduction. Well, there will be I will do a wrap up of days 1 and 2 with the highlights of what has been discussed. And then the important thing on this third day, panel number 4, a call to action, what works, what can be improved, and the need for a comprehensive and long-term vision. And with that, we will close the conference. So I hope that all of you will enjoy that, and we will pass the word to Robert Lisins from UN Economic Commission for Africa. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Prof. Distinguished participants representing African states, participants from national and regional institutions, participants from the private sector, civil society, NGOs, think tanks, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed great pleasure that I am sharing insights at this opening of this very important conference on a timely topic of private investment in electricity transmission in Africa. I was just mentioning to Prof that I arrived at Antananarivo in my hotel just at 4 p.m. So just on time to attend this meeting. It shows you how important this topic really is to the ACA where I work and to myself. Allow me first to welcome each of you to this conference, and I trust that you will find it valuable in expanding the scope for private sector participation in transmission infrastructure development on our continent. We all know that governments do not have sufficient resources to cover the need for transmission lines on our continent. The SDG 7 commitment African member states have entered into to accelerate progress on energy development, particularly electricity access, through the grid and off-grid solutions require sizable investments. Latest assessments indicate that Africa would require financing up to 120 billion a year in generation and grid expansion to meet SDG 7 targets. That's a huge amount of money. Member states of the African Union so far primarily pursue the energy access agenda through the public sector investment. This effort has yielded some positive results. Millions have got access to electricity on the continent, and transmission infrastructure, including interconnections, have been expanded. However, the lack of electricity access to 600 million people in the continent today, coupled with emergent requirements to expand infrastructure capacity to service industrialization, trade, and overall development, underscores the distance we still have to travel to close the infrastructure gap, including transmission access. Linked with the infrastructure gap is the financing challenge required. We estimate that we require between 3.2 and 4.3 billion annual transmission investment on the continent through 2030, requiring a new look on regulation and private sector investment in transmission assets. Best practices related to private sector investment in transmission infrastructure are available through various models, such as asset privatization, merchant lines, concessions, and independent power transmissions, each requiring rigorous regulatory and business climate preparations. I trust that this conference will delve deeper into these issues and share best practices for Africa. On behalf of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, allow me to share the following suggestions with participants in taking this work forward. One, we encourage you to undertake regulatory review of the transmission value chain to address key policy and regulatory barrier. I think in many countries, it's still a monopoly, the public sector controlling transmission. So it doesn't make too much sense to talk about private sector investment if they cannot participate in the first place. Second, consider adopting successful transmission business models, including under PPP arrangements to enhance private investment. Third, share your experiences and also learn from best practices related to openness to private investment and managing related risk. And finally, strive to establish regulatory and economic pricing systems for transmission services to enable effective private sector participation. And the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, together with the African School of Regulation, and inspired by the Continental Transmission Master Plan advanced by Elder Nepad, and I'm pleased to see Towelo dweller in this meeting, and in support of the PIDA transmission development initiatives, we stand ready to cooperate with national regulatory institutions to advance investment in transmission segment of the market. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stop here and to thank you for your attention, and I wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for the support that UNECA is always providing to the African School of Regulation. Thank you very much. So we will continue with the program. We are exactly on time. We are a little bit advanced. Robert and I have been very efficient. And so what we have now is a presentation on the situation of the investment transmission in Africa, and that will be done by Farai Kanonda, who is the Regional Sector Manager in the Africa Development Bank Group. So Farai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor, for the introduction. Unfortunately, I don't have a presentation, but I'll talk to all the issues as I go through in terms of the current situation of the transmission network.
Sure, this is many times this is even better than
Thank you.
Slides.
Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I understand we are scattered all over the world. So when we look at Africa, just to say that Africa has ample natural resources, and we are looking at about 39% of the world's renewable energy potential. But unfortunately, it still faces challenges of shortage of electric power supply, as the vast proportion of the population on the continent is without access to electricity. As things stand, somewhere between 600 and 700 million people, depending on what source you are using, live in sub-Saharan current Africa without access to electricity. And this corresponds to an electricity access rate for African countries of around 50%, sub-Saharan Africa specifically, which is the lowest in the world. Investment in new power generation over the past few decades has not matched with the corresponding investment in the electricity networks. And this now is a major constraint on increased access. Historically, sub-Saharan Africa investment in generation has been roughly 4 times higher than transmission and distribution investment combined. Existing transmission infrastructure in the region is also limited. A 2017 World Bank Group study found that 38 countries in sub-Saharan Africa had only about 112,000 kilometers of transmission lines, which is one of the lowest per capita rates of any region in the world, at about 247 kilometers per million people. Therefore, expanding the electricity sector by increasing regional integration, building more transmission lines, and upgrading transmission capacity is a key solution to addressing the access to electricity challenge. Transmission expansion can lower the average cost of supply through economies of scale and also promote diversification of electricity sources, including renewables, enhancing systems reliability and grid stability. This will require significant investment in a stable and interconnected transmission network, as expanding the transmission network. Staggering figures from the 2022 International Energy Agency report, which assumes universal access to modern energy services by 2030 and full implementation of all African climate pledges, show that up to 40 billion annual investment is required in the electricity grid between 2026 and 2030. Transmission expansion contributes about a third of this figure. So we're looking at about 13 billion, whilst the balance is in the distribution networks. Significant public and private capital is generally available for generation projects, particularly renewables, because of investor comfort with revenue models contract protections like take-or-pay arrangements and sovereign guarantees, and less legal difficulties surrounding land use in addition to the bankable returns. Private power sector investment in Africa has therefore focused largely on generation, primarily through independent power producer business models, and to some extent on distribution through public-private partnerships, concessions, and management contracts. However, medium and high voltage transmission is urgently and chronically underfunded. Alternatively, when one looks at building transmission infrastructure, especially in rural areas, it typically comes with low infrastructure grade margins and historically been limited to public and state entity ownership. Historically, most of the investments in transmission on the continent have therefore been made by state-owned utilities. Largely, these investments have been funded by governments or with support from government through sovereign-backed loans from multilateral development banks. However, this source of funding for the sector has not kept pace with the need for transmission infrastructure. Without additional sources of funding for the sector, Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for all, and the 2050 net zero climate commitments set by governments will not be met. Growing pressure on African government budgets, particularly in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, have compounded this problem as many nearer-term projects that had been earmarked for government support have now stalled. Across the continent, there are many transmission projects without funding at present, which have the potential to build critical infrastructure. As a result, many regional markets like Ghana and Nigeria have seen investment in generation capacity disproportionately outpace transmission and distribution investment, which can lead to lower utilization factors, curtailment, and frequency regulation problems for the system operator. In South Africa, under bid window number 6 of its Renewable Independent Power Producer Program, only 860 megawatts of projects were selected out of a procurement allocation of 4,200 megawatts, despite the dire need for new generation due to transmission constraints in the richest renewable energy resource provinces of Eastern, Northern, and Western Cape. Ultimately, deficient transmission infrastructure is a primary driver of unreliable power supply. Private investment in transmission is nothing new. Investors have mobilized over 55 billion in other emerging markets over the past 25 years. India provides a particularly useful example of the success that private financing of power transmission can have. In 2011, the Indian government liberalized the transmission sector to make it easier for private investors to pursue independent power transmission projects at a time when more than 30% of India's 1.2 billion citizens had no access to electricity. Over the next decade, private investment grew to account for over 11 billion in transmission financing, or 41% of all investments into transmission. Similarly, in Brazil, the embracing of the independent power transmission model has closed transmission gaps. The power transmission sector went from 100% state-owned in 1997 to today, including private companies, many of which work in partnership with local, state, and federal government agencies. On the continent, Zambia is one of the few African countries with a history of private sector involvement in transmission. Transmission lines operated by the Copper Belt Energy Corporation, which was privatized in the 1990s, supplies electricity to mines in the Copper Belt region. The economies of several African countries today mirror that of the countries like India, when it began exploring alternative structures for their transmission infrastructure. governments are now considering the potential for public-private partnerships on the continent. As an example, the Kenyan government, in collaboration with Africa 50 and the Power Grid Corporation of India, intends to pilot transmission line PPPs for 2 high-voltage transmission lines. Similarly, South Africa recently proposed the setting up of an independent transmission project office to enable private investment into the transmission infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, the bank has undertaken several initiatives to crowd in, de-risk, and catalyze private investment in transmission in sub-Saharan Africa. Under the New Deal on Energy for Africa, which aims to achieve universal access to cost-effective, affordable, and reliable electricity by 2030, the bank plans to ramp up public and private financing for investments in the energy sector. This strategy places an emphasis on developing on-grid transmission at regional and sub-regional levels to achieve the goal of 130 million new connections by 2030. The bank intends, through an ongoing PPP in transmission lines in Africa study, to pilot the use of PPPs as an alternative procurement method for transmission lines by recommending a standard template to be used in the development of such projects. It is a follow-up to the bank's Building Regional Power Markets in Africa series, which was launched in 2021, that proposed practical tools and mechanisms for accelerating regional and sub-regional projects, including guidelines to promote private sector participation in regional transmission projects. The bank is also pursuing other partnerships with the DFIs in the private sector, such as Exim Bank of India, IFC, Africa 50, the World Bank, Grid Company, USAID, Power Africa, and GridWorks, to increase private sector participation in project funding, mostly those targeted under the Continental Master Plan. This initiative is expected to grow and help accelerate development of key transmission corridors and also help speed up the creation of the African single electricity market. The African Development Bank and Swede Fund formalized a partnership agreement to attract private sector participation in independent power transmission lines in Africa. The 2 organizations will collaborate to promote private participation in transmission lines as a model of project financing, mainly through PPPs. This will be achieved through project preparation, bankability, development, and advisory support to African countries to encourage reforms that boost private sector investment and PPP projects, including stakeholder capacity building. The bank also, in collaboration with USAID, also launched the Power Africa Transmission Roadmap to 2030, with the objective of mobilizing at least $3 billion United States dollars to install about 7,500 megawatts of transmission capacity and bring at least 10 priority transmission projects to financial close. Ladies and gentlemen, let me end up here. I hope I have painted a picture of the current situation on the continent, and I'll hand it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farai, for very effective presentation and exactly on time. Well, I will follow now with the regulatory perspective on the same topic. Let me share my screen. I think that you see my screen now.
Yes,
oops, what happens? I am sharing. Okay, so you can see my screen now, right? No, but when I try to... Let's see again. Okay. Please confirm that you see my screen now.
Yes, Prof, we can see your
Okay,
screen.
thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk about regulatory approach, whether good common sense and sound regulation help enable private investment in power transmission in Africa. My main message in this presentation is that regulation, but creating unnecessary complexities, is shooting its own foot, and then regulation has to deal with these complexities, unnecessary complexities that have been created. Why not to choose a simple approach to regulation that will facilitate private investment in power transmission in Africa? Okay, so I will go quickly through some introductory topics that have been very well covered by Farai Kanonda. The evidence, I think, is overwhelming that there is no private investment in transmission in Africa. And I will put here some documents, recent documents, and the links that present the case that there is very little, if any, private investment in transmission at the moment. Although there are some interesting initiatives, like the one that was commented about Kenya line, some interesting approaches that are being promoted by GridWorks, some interesting initiatives in South Africa, but on the overall, this is not happening yet. And again, you have more documents that insist on the same topic. I will take just one slide from one of them, that after looking at a sample of 10 African countries, both in North, Central, South, East, and West, they find that in distribution plus transmission, the private investment in generation is 99.7%. Only 0.3% goes to distribution and transmission together. So the networks in Africa are not attracting private investment. I will focus on distribution, although there is a lot to say, of course, about, I will focus on transmission. There is a lot to say about distribution. But resorting to private investment is inevitable, as has been said before. These three documents here make the case very clearly for transmission, private investment in transmission. And the reasoning is kind of obvious. Transmission infrastructure is critical. Africa has very few kilometers of transmission line, lower than other parts in the world. Grid projects in sub-Saharan Africa have been made by the state-owned utilities, underwritten with sovereign guarantees, which is difficult to obtain in the current times. There is currently a need for significant additional investment, and that will be unlikely to be found with the current sources of funding, which is publicly supported by development financial institutions. And take into account that transmission, although it is very important, contributes a relatively small part of the overall cost of the sector value chain, something like 10% compared to 25 to 30% in distribution, and the rest 65, 70% for generation. But it is absolutely necessary. So there are several business models that have been mentioned before that could attract private investment. Some of them are difficult to implement in most of the African countries. And these models are concessions for the entire national network, independent transmission projects that I will mention in more detail now, privatization of the entire transmission network, and merchant lines, of which there are very few in the world, that try to make money by purchasing electricity on one end cheap and selling it more expensive on the other end. These are archetype models, and of course, each one of them could be adapted to the particular situations. The main proposal to be discussed in this conference, as we propose it, is not looking at the entire national networks, is not looking at how to privatize the entire network or how to create a concession for 20, 25, 30 years of the entire national network, but to attract private investment to key transmission projects. And maybe piecemeal to do this gradually to reinforce all that is needed in a national network. But let's think of investment in a few key transmission projects. And again, I bring these three documents that present the case for private investment and focus on one of the four models, which is the independent transmission project approach. The independent transmission project approach, the ITP model, involves the construction and maintenance of a single transmission line or a package of transmission lines. So there is no obligation of reinforcing or taking care of maintaining the rest of the transmission network in a country. So only a single line or a package of them under a long-term contract between the state-owned utility that is responsible for the entire transmission and the private project company that is established to undertake only that project. We know that there are critical reinforcements that are needed as obtained through the African Continental Master Plan. In the first panel, we will hear about that will provide a roadmap for integration between the different regions and the key projects, transmission projects that are needed for that. I have here an old slide that I couldn't get a more current one that indicates that there are key projects that will need to be built and they find financial difficulties to be implemented. The same thing happens at national level. And I have here Nigeria, just to take one example, showing the transmission lines that are proposed and that are needed to be developed. And I have here just to show you the case of the European Union, where every 2 years there is a 10-year network development plan. And the last one, 2022, the 2024 is about to be published. The 2022 identified 141 transmission projects and 23 storage projects, most of which will be done with private investment. And the key projects that are identified as having priority will have administrative treatment that will accelerate all the processes and subsidies of different kinds. So there is a focus on the priority projects. So the key issue that we are discussing here is how to make transmission attractive to private investment. And the problem is not lack or availability of capital. The problem is to have market regulations and project structures that provide predictable conditions and guarantees for the revenue that are fundamental for any private commercial investment. And it is difficult to do that when the transmission costs are not clear or when they are not transparently allocated within the sector. And this is exactly what is happening in Africa. And in my opinion, Africa is not learning from the successful experiences around the world, some of which have been commented now in the previous presentation, and including many successful experiences in developing countries. So how can regulation help? The challenge of power sector regulation and what makes it interesting, and I have devoted most of my professional life to power sector regulation, I think that the challenge is that the supply of electricity and also the consumption has to do with and requires a number of activities that are very different in nature and that require a separate individual regulatory treatment. So we should not regulate the same centralized generation, transmission, distribution, retail, distributed energy resources, system operation, or market operation, or power exchange. So all of them require a separate treatment. So what is the individual separate treatment that is needed for transmission? What is the regulatory characterization of transmission? Well, something that is difficult to make some people accept is that transmission of electricity is an infrastructure activity. Transmission is to deploy pylons, wires, insulators, breakers, transformers, substations, communications, protections, hardware, and to maintain and keep these assets in good operating condition most of the time during their economic lifetime. It is not about markets. It is not about buying and selling. It is about deploying infrastructure and being paid for it. And the secure and centralized operation of the power system, so what matters for security is not the responsibility of the network owners, it's the responsibility of the system operator that has to treat all the assets in a country equally. So there is no reason to impede having multiple owners of transmission assets in the same national transmission system, because once the transmission infrastructure is built, it will be securely operated by the national system operator. So transmission activity has the clear characteristics of a natural monopoly. Transmission of electricity has large economies of scale. Doesn't make sense to have 5 parallel lines owned by different companies instead of having one, because one to transport the same amount of electricity will be much cheaper. Rights of way make very difficult, as everybody knows, to have multiple providers. So better to have only one line that carries between point A and point B all the electricity that is needed, rather than having several lines. Of course, transmission has very large market power, because if you have only one line between point A and point B, if the owner could arbitrarily open the line or close the line, we could have immense market power, and people will need that line and will pay whatever. So that means that has to be regulated. And also we know that in general, the differences in electricity prices are not enough to cover the cost of transmission. Only a very specific cases, typically submarine lines between countries. So therefore, the transmission activity must be regulated as a natural monopoly with remuneration that will be based on cost of service, or maybe the outcome of an auction, deciding who will build a line. And that will be paid with uniform annuities that are absolutely predictable for the 40 or 50 years of the economic life of that asset. And it is a boring activity. It's a low-risk activity if regulated properly. And that could attract patient, risk-averse investors, like, for instance, pension funds. So is the current regulation of transmission helping? Well, I don't think so. I think that the current regulation creates unnecessary financial risk that, of course, have negative consequences for the cost of capital and will discourage private investors that very easily smell the risk. So in the next slide, I have a list of actions that have origin in flawed regulation that create unnecessary risk that is perfectly avoidable in the remuneration of the, sorry, it's a mistake, transmission activity. So what is the flawed regulation that creates investment risks? Well, first of all, revenues for transmission that depend on transactions or depend on the volume of utilization. It is very frequently in Africa to find the remuneration of a transmission assets depends on how much flow goes through the asset. But this is absolutely ridiculous, because the remuneration of that asset should be paying the cost. And we have seen is annuities that are perfectly predictable, that cover the CapEx and OpEx of that piece of infrastructure. And the owner of this transmission line cannot control how much flow will go through it, because that depends on whether in the country is raining in the south or in the north, or if this power plant is on and off, or if the demand is higher or lower. The owner of the transmission asset cannot control at all the flow. So remunerating on the basis of the flow creates a risk that is unacceptable for any reasonable private investment. So creative regulators update the historical rate base based on replacement costs. So if the transmission line, the cost was 100 when it was built, but now there is a different technology 7 years later, and the cost now is only 90 to do the same line because there are new techniques to do it, they update the historical rate base and pay the annuities or whatever is being paid based on 90 instead of the original cost. Again, that creates an unnecessary risk. If we know that the original cost was 100, pay based on 100 and not on the future developments in technology that could replace that line that already exists, and there is no need to replace it. The third point is that failure in ring-fencing the transmission revenue requirement. Remember that I am talking about individual investments, critical investments. If the cost, the percentage of the cost of electricity that transmission represents is 10%, and we are talking about a few reinforcements in the entire network of a country, we are talking of the fraction of 10%. So maybe 1 or 2% of the total cost of electricity. I am sure that the governments and regulators, we could find an easy way to ring-fence that small amount of money. I know that the tariffs don't cover the costs in most African countries. And I know that there are theft and that there are commercial losses and that people don't pay. But for the sake of having some key transmission investments, ring-fencing 1 or 2% of the total revenue that is obtained through the tariffs, I don't think that this is something that regulators cannot do. Then some other problems that regulation creates unnecessary is to have flawed cost allocation methods, particularly when we are talking about cross-border transactions, cross-border transmission lines that make difficult for some countries to accept paying a certain fraction of the cost. Frequent recalculation of transmission charges or changes in methodology that will create uncertainty for the investors. If we agree that this piece of infrastructure will have an economic life of 40 years and should be paid the annuity for 40 years, why don't we leave it as it is instead of being creative and making changes in methodology? Also create incentives that go beyond the reliability of the line. So transmission, the owner of a transmission line should not have incentives that have to do with the overall losses in the system or the overall reliability of the system, because the owner of a piece of infrastructure is only responsible for the reliability of that infrastructure. And also uncertainty about what happens at the end. So the contract should clearly establish what happens at the end of the lifetime, economic lifetime of the asset. In some cases, you could say that the residual value will be remunerated to the owner of the transmission line, and the transmission line will be passed the ownership to the national transmission network, or whatever arrangement is decided, but that has to be clear from the beginning. So in summary, transmission must be treated as a regulated monopoly, not introduce unnecessary risk for investors. So use just the cost of service instead of creative methods of volume of flows or wheeling charges that are create unnecessary risk and also are wrong. Then ring-fence the annuity for these critical pieces of transmission and have clear and stable transmission cost allocation rules for cross-border transmission. And for that, I will leave you with these three references that are great in presenting the case of this approach, private investment in transmission. And now I think that we break for 10 minutes and we restart at 4 p.m. Central African time and 3 p.m. Central European time. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. What were you saying, Danny? What's the mention?
So we break for 10 minutes now. And we will start with panel number 1 at either 3 or 4 p.m., depending on where you are located. For some other people will be very different. Okay, I see that it is now 4 Central African time and 3 Central European time. So time to start with our first panel, and that the moderator is Mark Goldstein, co-founder and director of Africa Power Ventures Global. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and hi to everybody. Very nice to be here. And as Ignacio said, I'll be the moderator for this panel discussion, which is going to focus on the current situation and experiences for investment into transmission in Africa, and mainly private investment into transmission in Africa. So we'd like to hear from panelists to understand what is happening on the ground. Allow me to introduce the panelists. We're joined today by Tawela Nyirenda-Jere, Head of Economic Integration from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. We've also got Chris Flavin, who's the Head of Business Development for Gridworks. We've got Moshood Abolade, Investment Director Project Development for Africa 50. And we've got Umar Bangura, who is the Principal Legal Expert for the ECOWAS Regional Electricity Regulatory Authority. So welcome, everybody. Great to have you here. And I'm not sure, I don't see Chris on screen. Is Chris with us? Okay, well, hopefully he'll join in time. If not, we will carry on. So to start off with, just a few words on the format. I think that what we'll do is I will take up a few minutes of precious time to talk to you a little bit about my own experiences with transmission investment in Southern Africa. And then I will give the panelists a chance to, if they'd like a chance, to just present some of their prepared remarks. And then we'll move into the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's get started. First of all, let me give you a little bit of kind of background on Southern Africa and what's happening here. We've also heard a little bit from the previous presenters on some of the issues in Southern Africa, but I will give you our view on it as well. So I think if we're looking at the state of transmission infrastructure, traditionally, there have been two ways of investment into infrastructure. So first of all, there's kind of the networks inside the country. Typically, as Ignacio was saying, they're recovered through the rate base, some sort of fixed charge that, the utility will charge to customers, and that kind of covers the cost of those assets. And that's spread throughout all the customers. And then we've also got the interconnectors between the countries, and that becomes a little bit more problematic. And we've seen a lot of those projects stall in Southern Africa because we couldn't work out over the years a kind of useful or appropriate business model to fund new interconnected development. So that's it. And then kind of, the way that the Southern African power pool developed was, of course, and the interconnectors that were developed up to date have been, so for example, that the hydro-rich nations could share their excess electricity when there was lots of water in the rivers, with the thermal kind of dominated countries in the south, and then in times of kind of poor hydro conditions, they could send the power back up to the north. That was kind of the idea behind it. So there has been some development of networks through those bilateral transactions that were put in place, but to be honest, the state of infrastructure development in Southern Africa is quite stagnant. If I think about it, I've probably seen the same projects listed on the same spreadsheet for the last, I guess, since almost 2000, with many of them never having been built. So the question is, for me personally, why have they not been built? What are the conditions that have led to some of those projects never coming to life? Part of it is just that there wasn't enough demand to kind of make them a reality. And part of it is also due to some of the constraints that the Prof put up on his slide earlier on, where we saw, and then especially things about the bankability of the utility. That's a big issue for us, and the ring fencing of, as you were saying, the ring fencing of those funds to cover the cost of transmission. So those are two of the big things. When we look at Southern Africa, we can see that there's a lot of congestion and there's a bottleneck from south to north. Most of the power at the moment flows from Mozambique through South Africa up through Botswana and Zimbabwe to Zambia, where CEC is, and we've already heard about Copperbelt Energy Corporation earlier on. But you know, the bottleneck through Zimbabwe, that only allows about 200 megawatts an hour, which is a tiny amount. And if you look at the overall volume of trade on for example, the day-ahead market, the wholesale market, it's quite small. There are some bilateral transactions still taking place, but the trade is quite small and could be much larger. So that's kind of what's happening on the ground from that perspective. And as the prof was saying, you know, most of these countries are facing, you know, unserved energy issues, what they call load shedding in this part of the world. You know, where there just simply are many hours where you can't get access to electricity, it's not being produced. And so that detracts from, you know, the people focus on generation, they don't focus on investments in transmission. So that's by and large the state of where we are at the moment. What's quite interesting to us is that there are some changes that are taking place. First of all, we've seen changes in the market structure in Namibia and Zambia, which formal changes in the market structure, which are driving kind of new investments. I mean, for example, if you look at Namibia, we have a country which has got a peak demand of about 600 megawatts. And when they changed their market structure to allow for exports and bilateral transactions between, you know, IPPs and customers in the country, they had 1 gigawatt of licensed exporters, you know, kind of within a couple of years, looking for a way to get power out of the country because of the shortage of supply. And suddenly you've got congestion, you know, and you've already got congestion in the Northern Cape in South Africa. So it's difficult for that power to find a market. So that's quite interesting. There are changes. We also heard about the fact that South Africa is now considering using a boot style, structure to invite in private power, private transmission investment. And we also obviously have the ART fund in the Southern African Power Pool, which is aiming to raise about $1.3 billion worth of investment to drive some of these projects that have been sitting in the spreadsheet for so many years. So there are changes taking place. As the prof said, we would prefer that the regulatory environment be supportive. Unfortunately, in many cases, what's happening is that you know, the markets are driving people to change. There's organic change taking place without regulation to support it. But nevertheless, we can say that in the South they are. But that's it for the South. I would like to now invite the panelists to give some prepared remarks and to talk about it. Tuwele, if I can start with you. It would be great to hear about, you know, what's happening. We've seen the PETA, you know, progress report, the 10-year progress report. Maybe if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, the master plan, your kind of idea about maybe the single African market. It would be wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists and to the participants in the conference as well. So no prepared statements on my part, but maybe just to share a little bit in terms of some of the work that we've been doing, and especially as it relates to the discussion today. So you've mentioned the PETA 10-year progress report, which I think highlights a number of key issues insofar as the progress that we've made as far as advancing regional and continental projects on the continent, but also I think points to some of the successes, but also the challenges. And I think one thing that we are very clear to mention is the fact that there's a lot of public investment in infrastructure. So when you look at the PETA portfolio over the last 10 years, a lot of those investments did indeed come through governments and government initiatives and public funding. So I think important to acknowledge always that governments will continue perhaps by and large to be a significant contributor to the funding. Also, it's significant to mention the fact that, and I think as it pertains to this discussion, is that we don't see the same levels of private sector participation, you know, broadly in infrastructure projects that are, you know, cross-border to the same levels that we would see perhaps in other regions of the world. And maybe this is also part of the discussions that we're having here in trying to just understand and unpack what are some of those issues perhaps that make it very difficult for private sector to invest. Very specific to the energy sector, so you're aware that we have the Continental Power Systems Master Plan, and then the African Union Commission is championing AFSEM, which is the Africa Single Energy Market. Perhaps also important to acknowledge and recognize the fact that now both the CMP and AFSEM have been endorsed as flagship projects of Agenda 2063. So we hope that this will raise the profile in terms of some of these discussions that we're having, in terms of some of the policy signaling, in terms of also just making sure that everybody is really aware of the significance of both of these two initiatives. The CMP elaborates, of course, the Continental Power Systems Master Plan, which looks at the different kinds of projects that are needed on the continent insofar as changing Africa's energy outlook, looking at both the generation and transmission capacities and demand and supply, and also looking at the very specific issues around how will we build and create a system that will allow us to actually trade efficiently and effectively in power within the continent, but also outside of the continent. When we look at the elaboration of the CMP itself, I think the process is perhaps also in some ways responding to some of the challenges that we're seeing insofar as being able to adopt a consistent and coherent way of tackling the idea of how we plan for our infrastructure, energy infrastructure systems, but also taking note of some of the projects that will be needed if we are indeed to achieve the aspirations. So the large interconnectors that will be needed between the different regions, but also these being fed, of course, by what will happen at a national level. And then AFSAM is unpacking the regulatory and policy and legal elements that will actually drive this. And I think that perhaps is also very central to this discussion, because we see that a lot of the challenges perhaps emanate from this lack of maybe coherency in terms of the way in which the systems are regulated across the continent. So I'll have much more to say about this perhaps as the discussion progresses, but suffice to say that we look at the two as very complementary and very essential in terms of where we're going as a continent, but also linking this very generally and broadly to the Continental Free Trade Area, and recognizing the fact that as a continent, we are not going to move, we're not going to progress if we're not able to solve some of these challenges of how we actually plan, build, and finance the infrastructure that we need in the energy sector. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Tuelo. That was great. Yeah, we will certainly come back to that, and we will talk about that a lot more. But let me pass over now to Moshood. Moshood, I'm not sure if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about Africa 50's program, and specifically the project, I think, that was already mentioned by Ignacio, which was the one in Kenya, the PPP project. That would also be very interesting to hear about. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. To all the panelists, as well as, all the participants in this webinar. So Africa 50, just by way of background, is a multilateral investment platform that has the mandate to invest in infrastructure across, multiple sectors. And I think one of the key things that we realize, given that, we are mostly sovereign owned, is that our capital needs to go provide additionality in the infrastructure space. And one of the areas that we identified was the transmission space, where we thought that, there was significant underinvestment in this space compared to generation. And we thought, this is an area where Africa 50 can drive impact. So sometime in 2019, we got a mandate from the government of Kenya to develop, transmission lines under a PPP framework. As a combination of, various studies and undertakings in Kenya, we identified two candidate lines that we thought were, suitable for a PPP investment model by way of an IPT. I think that has been touched on in earlier presentations. This represents our flagship project where we've made a lot of strides trying to, leverage, the successes of the IPPs in Kenya, as well as the support of the government, and the increased push for the transmission utility, TETRACO, to move towards a private investment model. So I think all of these have been sort of tailwinds for this project, where we've gotten a lot of support, from the lender community, as well as, from the EPC community, to be able to come up with, what is a sort of bankable proposition in form of a private investment proposal for the government of Kenya to review and, to approve as a PPP. And we at Africa 50, we consider this, a flagship project that can be replicated in other countries. And as a matter of fact, we are at various stages of discussions with 8 other utilities on the continent who have seen off the back of the success of this Kenya flagship, who have seen how private investment and private expertise can be used to help accelerate their transmission system master plans. And our research has shown that over the next 10 years, there's about $35 billion of investment that is required across the top 10 economies on the continent to help implement their transmission development master plans. And a lot of these projects, when you look at the current physical space of most sovereigns on the continent today, it sort of underscores the significance of the investment opportunity for the private sector. And it is the reason why at Africa 50 we continue to advocate for private sector participation by engaging with utilities and regulators across our shareholder countries and our non-shareholder countries on the continent to sort of to continue to engage and to educate the stakeholders in country on how these models can be replicated and how it can be used to sort of drive transmission sector investment. So I guess in the course of the remaining part of the conversation, I will touch a bit more on some specifics on on how on the key issues that we see, as well as how the IPT model can be how the nuances can be used in different countries given the current context to be able to accelerate the development of transmission infrastructure in each of these countries. So back to you, Mark.
That's excellent. Thank you. We definitely, I mean, if you're already talking to, I think you said eight other countries, then we're going to be asking you maybe if you can put some names on the table. I'm not sure if it's possible, or if you can talk about the project specifically. And also those key success factors, what are the 5 key things that really will drive the success of this kind of business model? So Umar, I mean, Tuwela's already mentioned, the importance of regulation in kind of making these projects work in supporting the development of these independent transmission projects and the master plan in general. I mean, our own experience is that kind of, unfortunately, regulation gets developed by different countries in different ways, which is often kind of not complementary. So it would be interesting to hear from you. I mean, as a kind of part of the ECOWAS region, whether that's your experience and whether or not you think that ultimately, we've got regulation which is supporting the development of ITP or not at the moment.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Because I have a problem with my speakers. I didn't hear you very well, but I understand that you want me to talk about the transition project in ECOWAS. Oh?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, my fellow panelists. Good afternoon, all the participants. Yes, in ECOWAS, we are trying to, let's say, to set up a regional electricity market. And of course, the market cannot go without a transmission line. So this project has developed through what we call a master plan, which is, let's say, a kind of agreed document is adopted by all of the member states through treaty signed by the head of state. We call it ECOWAS Master Plan for the development of regional power generation and transmission infrastructure. So the last one that has been adopted is data. It has been adopted since let's say the first one. No, sorry. The first one has been adopted in 1999, and based on the common list cost planning cost translated into the regional master plan, it is adapted periodically. And the latest one has been signed in 2018, if I remember. So the master plan currently, which is valid from the period from 2019 to 2033, comprises 75 regional projects, including generation projects and transmission projects. for a total investment required for about $36 billion. Sorry. And among these 75 regional projects, we have almost 28 transmission projects for approximately, let me see my note, let's say approximately 22,000 kilometers of high voltage transmission line for an estimated cost of $10 billion. And of course, all of this plan has been developed, and we have a short-term plan for 2019 to 2022, where we plan to develop almost 8,000 high voltage line. And in the medium term, meaning from 2023 to 2029, almost 4,000 actual high voltage line. And for the long term, meaning 2030 to 2023, almost 10,000 high voltage line, which we plan to be developed. But of course, what I want to, as we are talking about, let's say, funding issue, you should know that all of these projects are mainly funded by what you call the partner, technical and financial partner, meaning multilateral donors and bilateral donors coming from main member states. And the private investments are rare, or let's say zero. And maybe during the discussion, I will talk about the challenge we are facing in implementing these projects, mainly, let's say, for instance, the fund mobilization for the project preparation, the insecurity and health crisis, as well as also we are facing in some member states the program of strategies to develop these projects. All of these challenges are delaying, of course, the implementation of this kind of projects. Of course, if you can now attract investment, private investment in the sector in the regional sector to develop this transmission line, to be very good for the regional market. So that's what I can say for the moment.
Thank you, Omar. Appreciate that. Ignacio, have we got Chris with us?
No, well, I was going to say that I don't see Chris, but I see Ryan Ketchum, who is a colleague of Chris, and maybe you would like to say something. Otherwise, just continue with your panelists. Ryan?
Hi, Ignacio. Yeah, sure. I would love to say a few things. I think one of the things that's very interesting about an independent transmission project in particular is that we think a lot about how should the sector be regulated. And yet, if you think about how an ITP is structured, really, it shares many of the same characteristics as an IPP. And when you think about an IPP and how it's regulated, usually you think in terms of conducting a competitive tender to establish an energy charge, if it's a renewable IPP, or a capacity charge or an availability charge, if it is a thermal IPP or if it's a dispatchable IPP. And really that makes the regulation piece quite a bit easier. Of course, the regulator needs to regulate the utility that is buying power from an IPP, but actually the rate for the energy, the rate that the utility pays for the energy is not really established by regulation in most cases. There are some exceptions for perhaps a feed-in tariff or other unique cases, but it's set by an auction. And I think that, one of the unique aspects of ITPs is that the capacity payment or the availability payment, or however you want to call that, would typically be set with an auction, which really makes regulating these types of projects much easier, much simpler. And it also simplifies the changes to the legislative framework, the changes to the regulatory framework that need to be made to implement these projects. When you think about when IPPs began and when utilities began to enter into power purchase agreements, actually very few changes were necessary to the regulatory framework. And really, I mean, one of the few changes that was necessary was the ability to grant a generation license to an independent power project. And then the capacity charge or the energy charge was set through a reverse auction. I see ITPs in much the same way, and I feel like the number of changes that need to be made to a legislative framework and to a regulatory framework to implement these types of projects is actually very small in most cases.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, it sounds like from the presentation that the prof gave, and it sounds like from what you're saying that actually, as you said, the issue is not really with the regulation of the ITP. The issue is with the regulation of the utility, just to make sure that you kind of you ring fence or you get those predictable revenues for the ITP, so that they can go about their business and, as you say, focus on the availability of the line and that's it, nothing else. So from that perspective, it is a simplification. Maybe people have a view that it needs to be more complex and that you need to be more involved as a regulator, but perhaps not.
Perhaps not. And just like in an independent power project, the key document, at least in my perspective, and the one that I've spent the majority of my career negotiating, is the power purchase agreement.
Yeah.
Which lays out the terms and conditions of the deal, lays out the energy charge or the capacity charge. That's really the key document. And in an ITP or an IPT, depending on which acronym you prefer, the similar or the analogous document would be a transmission service agreement. And it lays out many of the same things. From where to where does this transmission line go? What are the improvements that need to be made to the substations on the end? What are the specifications for the line? How much will the utility pay for the availability of that line? How do you deal with force majeure events? What are the, how many hours a year can the line be down for maintenance? All the same things that you wind up addressing in a power purchase agreement, you need to address in a transmission service agreement. Of course, there is kind of, the largest difference between the two is that in an IPP, you're dealing with usually a relatively small plot of land, and it's relatively easy to obtain rights over that land. In a transmission project, you're dealing with a very long corridor. You need to obtain way leaves, easements, ownership, perhaps over the areas where substations will go. So that is a bit more complex. But actually, I think that they are remarkably simple.
Yeah. So, I mean, Tuwela, we've heard from Ryan, who's talked about kind of very specific project level, how simple it can be at that level, and we've heard from Ashud at his level, which is talking about the PPP partnership. I mean, how can you use what they're talking about to kind of influence this continental master plan, which is at a much higher level? You're looking at projects which are kind of interregional projects. Of course, they're at a country level as well because they have to be to connect up all the different regions. But do you think that this can work? I mean, that this approach could work in your world as well?
So I don't think the question is if it can work. The issue is it has to work. And if it doesn't work, then what else do we have? Ultimately, we have to make this work. But I think we to the points being made by Ryan and also to what Prof said previously about maybe Africa learning from what has happened in other regions. I think that's a fair point. But at the same time, I think we must never forget that we're dealing with 55 countries. 55 countries, 5 regions. A lot of diversity in terms of whether it's the linguistic diversity, whether it's the legal context and so on. So that diversity does present, I think, some unique challenges. It does present some unique problems, but these are the things that we have to grapple with and we have to solve. So when we look at the master plan, for instance, and together with AFSTEM, I think the idea is really to try to bring some commonality, some standardization in terms of the process that is used as far as the planning. But that should then also trigger some commonality in terms of how we approach regulation. The question and the challenge perhaps is the fact that currently we are working with the 5 geographic regions, which by nature also then extend into the 5 regs, and not 5 regs, 8 regs, but 5 power pools technically. And these are the power pools that interconnect amongst themselves and then will need to be interconnected at a continental level. And when you look at the master plan, looked at 2 different scenarios. One scenario, it was just looking at integration just from the perspective of the different regions themselves and sort of saying, okay, if we just look at each region in isolation and see what happens insofar as the different projects in that region, what will be what does that scenario look like? And then the other scenario was to look at full integration across the continent and making sure that all the power pools are interconnected. In terms of investments, not much difference as far as those 2 scenarios are concerned. But definitely when it comes to now talking about issues around regulation and the legal and regulatory frameworks, I think it will by and large be very different. Because if you're dealing with a region, so for instance, Omar has been talking about ECOWAS and the West African Power Pool. ECOWAS, I think, is very clear in terms of how they deal with policy issues as a region. So they have directives, and the directives are binding on member states. Other regions don't have the same kind of approach where the agreements are made, but they're not binding. So if you're dealing with just one region, perhaps it's easier to solve some of those challenges. So when we now start looking at the continental level and we want to sort of have everybody playing on a level playing field and adhering to the same frameworks and standards, it gets a little bit more complicated. But at the same time, it does have to be done. I think the issue that we'll have to face is what is the path to that? How do we arrive there? Do we start with this regional approach, which is currently perhaps the de facto situation that we have now, or do we allow ourselves to say let's just unpack all of this, look at what's working in terms of what the regions are doing, what constitutes good practice, and then introduce that as the standard and the model for the continent? And I don't have the answer. I mean, I think the different stakeholders will spend the next year or so, discussing and talking through the different options and scenarios to come out with the best path towards that full integration. But I think we mustn't underestimate the fact that there is a lot of complexity in it. And yes, the solutions are simple, but we are not working in a simple system. I think that complexity, also has to be understood. The other thing I wanted just to touch on a little bit, perhaps, was this idea of the ring fencing of the revenues and how that perhaps can be used to support the development of the transmission ecosystem. If you look at, and I'm giving an analogy from the ICT sector, where again we have the ICT regulators, they collect certain licensing fees and so on and so forth from the various operators. And typically we found that it doesn't always work as intended. It doesn't always work well in terms of how those funds are utilized. So the question for the energy sector is, how are we going to do it differently such that those funds that are being collected and pooled are actually being addressed and directed towards the intended purposes? Back to you.
So maybe I can just ask a question specifically about the complexity, what you were saying there before we move on to another panelist again, to Ella. But just, I mean, to Ryan's point, it sounds like what they're saying is that kind of, you can avoid the complexity, the regulatory complexity, if you follow an ITP approach. I'm sorry if I'm paraphrasing you there, Ryan, but I mean, it kind of sounds like you can get away because you're not dealing with utility to utility, or you're kind of not really, you know, too worried about the regulations. You can have this reverse auction, and it's kind of a very standalone transaction, and how the utilities recover their costs, etc., is kind of completely outside of this. This is just an availability charge that you're paying to this person to keep the line up and running, and that's kind of it. Do you think that that can work to avoid some of this regulatory complexity that you're talking about?
It could, but I think the question that I would pose there is that if you're dealing in a national context, maybe it's easier to deal with. But if you're now crossing borders, I think it becomes a bit different then. And the challenge also there is the same way as we see with the CFTA, that once we start talking about full integration and so on, there's always this concept of winners and losers. Some will gain, some will lose. And the question is, how do you balance out that winning and losing in the context of trying to achieve the continent's aspirations, but then also looking at the ambitions of countries and regions as well?
Can you just tell me a little bit more about the winning and losing? Sorry, you said somebody will win and somebody will lose.
Well, I mean, like with the CFTA, I think there's always been this discussion about the fact that, in the implementation of the CFTA and this idea of trying to make it possible for countries to trade seamlessly and you're removing all the non-tariff barriers, you're dealing with all these issues, that not every country will benefit in the same way from that openness. That some countries benefit more when the system is not as open. And perhaps it will be the same also when we're talking about the Content Master Plan and this idea of full integration. So we need to anticipate that. And we need to then think through how we resolve some of those concerns that countries may have.
Thanks. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you, Mark. I think that Toela has really put her finger right on one of the most difficult issues that will come up with independent transmission projects. And that is that the structure was originally designed to work inside a particular country. And of course, there are many countries which need significant investment within their own borders. But as Toela and others have observed, there is also a continental master plan. There is also a great need for investment that crosses borders. And I think the key question in these cases, if you want to use ITPs, is which utility is purchasing the capacity. So if you have two countries that want to build transmission between them, and they both have a state-owned utility which is responsible for transmission within their borders, and you have a transmission line that crosses the border, in my mind, the simplest solution is you establish a project company to undertake the independent transmission project, and then that project company enters into a transmission service agreement with utility A in country A, and another transmission service agreement with utility B in country B. And how utility A and utility B recover the costs that they incur under the transmission service agreements they entered into is the subject for the regulator in that particular country. Of course, there are rules and directives that are overlaid on top of that, and it depends on which regional market you're thinking of or where this occurs. But in my mind, that is the simplest solution, and it's the solution that kind of most closely sticks to the principles that underlie an ITP in general.
Right. I think maybe the other side of the coin, though, is, let's say, just keeping with this example for a moment, because it's quite interesting. If we're talking about a cross-border line, you enter into the service agreement with the two utilities, and they're each paying this availability charge to have the line. But then the question becomes, well, how do they recover the costs for that line, especially when the line is there for kind of, let's say, power pool trade, as opposed to some sort of benefit to the customers in that country, because they must now recover that cost. And And is that cost now recovered through wheeling charges? I mean, typically that's the way it would be done, right? In a power pole, it would be a kilowatt hour based charge, but it is quite interesting. I see we've joined by Chris. Chris, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Very sorry to join late. I was in a meeting that overran and then stuck in public transport. So huge apologies, everyone.
No problem. Ryan stepped in and has been filling your shoes very ably. So
very good. Thank you, Ryan.
Trying to.
Chris, I gave everybody a chance at the beginning of the discussion just to kind of talk for 5 minutes if they had any prepared remarks or anything specific that they wanted to highlight. Would you like to add or go ahead?
Sure, thank you. I mean, the topic obviously is the current situation and experiences of private investment in transmission in Africa. From Gridworks' perspective, we were set up with a mandate to focus on transmission and distribution, as well as off-grid energy on the continent. We've been going for a few years now. Our experience to date is obviously that, you know, ready-made investment opportunities don't exist. The only organizations who are going to get traction in this section at the moment are ones with a mandate to develop projects and create opportunities to invest in. So organizations like Gridworks and like Africa 50, I see Mashoud's on the call today as well, who can go and do the early stage work. Now, early stage work takes time. Generation projects on the continent have been going for a couple of decades now, and even then generation projects take time. So we're right at the start of a nascent sector. At Gridworks, we've got a number of transmission projects in development at the moment, and at various points of the development cycle. And our aim is to make these the reference projects for the markets that they're in, so that others can come and invest in the sector as well. When we started a few years ago, we really were having to knock on doors and speak to governments and state-owned utilities and talk to them about fresh concepts, about why this form of capital being available to governments in Africa is important, how it's been used elsewhere in the world, and where the tool of private investment can fit in a sector that's been mostly publicly funded to date. And a lot of the time, we were the first people making those arguments in a lot of those markets. What's changed in the last few years is that there seems to be a degree of consensus around appropriate models. A lot of governments are now pursuing projects like ITPs and interested in doing this because they realise that the traditional forms of funding used in the sector just aren't available anymore, or to the extent that they're not available, to the extent they are available, they require public support from governments with stretched balance sheets. So I think, look, we're still very early in the sector. But there's consensus that IPTs have a role to play, and there's real interest from governments in moving in this direction. Where we go from here, I think, is just that we need more capacity at government level to engage with the private sector in this specific sector, more support for governments, because these are complex transactions and they take up government bandwidth. And I think we need more blended capital to make projects viable as well, because not every project can be viable on its own. And in other markets, governments and government balance sheets have been able to provide some subsidy or public sector support to the private sector for the transmission sector. And in Africa, I think that role is going to have to fall with the MDBs on a lot of occasions. So I've come late. I've sort of summarized some high-level views. I'll stop there for now. I may be repeating what others have said already.
No, thank you, Chris. That was excellent. And it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, certainly, you know, we do see quite a lot of different types of transactions in Africa taking place. I mean, for example, in Mozambique, you know, with the development of the gas-fired power plant, the Damani gas-fired power plant, what they've done is they've leveraged that power plant to actually develop a lot of the networks inside Mozambique. So they kind of get discretionary funding from a lot of the large donor organizations, you know, which they then use to kind of fund these transmission projects at a very low cost, and they're obviously linked to the generation asset. So there are many different ways to kind of skin the cat, as you say. But Mashoud, you mentioned earlier on a little bit about your project. I think we want to hear more detail about this PPP project that you've developed as this kind of prototype, I guess, or in Kenya. And can you just give us a little bit more information about it and what the key lessons learned were and how you're going to use that to roll these projects out? You said in another 8 countries or in another 8 markets?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I think, if I start from, what we consider the key ingredients, I think at the moment we are at the stage where, we are now starting to engage closely with governments. I think as Ryan mentioned earlier, this project in terms of structure, very similar to the IPPs. So we're going to have a transmission services agreement that would be negotiated with the user of the transmission service, which is KPLC. Also, we're going to have the concession agreement that gives the rights to sort of build the line, operate it, and transfer it at the end of the period. But I think to get to the point where we are today, there are essentially 5 key ingredients that I would like to mention. Right. The first being, I think when I was speaking earlier, I said when we started in 2019, it was just a mandate to see how we can do transmission lines as a PPP, right? We had to look at, quite a number of lines within the master plan just to, assess them for their viability. So one of the key things I would say, which would be applicable to any market is, from a sector standpoint, right? When we talk about transmission infrastructure, it essentially is one network, right? That's supposed to provide services to end users. But the IPT, what it does is it allows you to, to sort of ring fence limbs and nodes of this network and finance those. So the first thing is the entire master plan or the network in whatever time frame that you're looking at it has to be feasible and viable, right? There before you then start to talk of the component parts. So, there are certain lines that do make sense, or perhaps don't make sense now, but maybe in 10 years. There are certain lines that make sense now, but the truth is, they cannot be viable on their own, as Chris said earlier. So, you need to start to find workarounds to deliver them. There are certain lines that, you need to develop before you can do other lines. So from a project specific and network standpoint, projects do need to be viable. The other thing is the regulatory framework. When we started this project in Kenya at the time, there was no transmission tariff within the context of the entire electricity sector. But what our project has been able to do is to draw attention to the fact that, transmission is an asset and is an asset that needs to be compensated when built. Today, we haven't gotten there yet, but what I can say is that, today there is a tariff that is being implemented for transmission that at least covers operation and maintenance costs. And we see this as a stone thrown in the right direction to ensure that, we do get there by the time, this project is perhaps commissioned. Also, the Energy Act does provide, has a provision for licensing transmission lines, but before now, it's only been KETRACO. With our project, the regulator has sort of realized that there needs to be a process. There is a bit of ambiguity in the act, but I think the regulator is now working on the process for licensing, IPTs in the country. Another thing I would like to mention is essentially risk allocation, right? I mean, it is an important topic, but it could be downplayed a lot of times just because in the markets where PPPs have been done, people tend to overlook, what balanced risk allocation and how it could implicate a project, right? The sort of stance we've taken in Kenya is that, which I believe, the government of Kenya does agree, is given that this is the very early stages and we're trying to, create a demonstration project, right? The risk allocation for it to be balanced today, what that balance means today and in 5 or 10 years would be different. And what we're trying to do with this project is to create a path to where, as the market is being created and interest is being generated, certain risk responsibilities or allocation might fall to the private sector as things go along. And I think this is very, very important if you are to get to a bankable project in any market in Africa today, given that this concept is very new. The final thing that I'll mention is, with respect to tariff and commercial principles, right? I think this has been touched on in other in other submissions made by the panelists. which is tariffs need to be based on availability payments. They need to be done in such a way that costs can be recovered, and the assets being built are seen as a service rather than as a commodity that as a commodity being transported from one point to the other. Just because if you have to spur investment, there needs to be certainty around capital recovery, as well as being able to pay for your operating costs. And I think finally, the other sort of nuance I would add is, I think Tawela mentioned it earlier, or I think it was you where you said perhaps you could create structures for private sector to come and do projects in markets where they're able to sort of recover their investment, and then while you sort of leave the utilities in status quo. What we're doing in Kenya is we are advocating for the utility itself to get the same treatment as private sector. I think one area that has been sort of peddled around is our utilities are not viable, they're not bankable. And the thinking behind this is, if they get the same treatment, right, the level of service would improve. You would have competition given various players in the market. And we recognize that, again, when you have multiple ITPs in a country, they're not competing against each other. They're essentially part of a broad network that is supposed to, give services to the end user. So what we are preaching in Kenya is, give Ketraco the same treatment as the private sector, and then you will start to see improvements across the board. Back to you.
Thanks, Mashood. Sure. Sounds like you've been on quite a journey in the development of this project. Lots of experiences and lots of wisdom that anybody who's looking to develop a project can probably come and talk to you and get some good insight. Umar, we've left you alone, but I want to pull you back into the conversation for a moment. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that you said there's zero private sector investment into transmission networks in ECOWAS. In your view, I mean, what kind of approach or what change needs to be made to allow that to happen? I mean, what do you need to do in order to make private transmission investments, happen in your part of the world? You're on mute.
Okay. My point of view is that as it's a new in our region, it should go, let's say, progressively. To try to put, for instance, a framework where it is possible to go step by step by starting by, let's say, a joint funding project by what you call this public partnership, with to include them progressively in this kind of project. And also, of course, it's going with all of this legal framework that we should put in place in the various countries, but harmonizing the current rules and institutions in charge of this project. Yes.
Thanks, Amar. Yeah, so I think we don't have too much time left. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody for your inputs. I mean, I can't summarize everything that was said, and I'm sorry we've only got had an hour, but just quickly, I mean, Tawela, thank you very much. Take away that we should not ignore the complexity of the regulatory differences and differences between regions. Ryan kind of gave us some insight into how simple it can be, and perhaps that there's some wisdom in that as well, that you don't have to overcomplicate and regulate it. Chris explained that. I see that there are some questions in the Q&A. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, Chris was talking about having to go out there and make these projects happen in this nascent industry, and Mashood gave us some insight into how he's had to drive this project going forward. So let's see if I can see, while we've got some time left in the Q&A. I beg your pardon, I didn't see these. At what point is the Kenyan PPP project at the moment? How far are you from COD, Moshe?
Yeah, so I think our estimates are that COD would take anywhere from 24 to 36 months. I think we are trying to be innovative in that fashion. I think one of the key critical path items is land and right of way. I think anyone that has done projects in Kenya, would understand the complexity involved in this. But I think at the moment we are about, we are less than 12 months away from financial close, given, a lot of the detailed or heavy lifting has been done prior to our current engagement with the government, which under the PPP Act requires us to submit a private investment proposal, which essentially is a detailed proposal for the project. So given where we are and the approach that we've taken, I believe that, we should announce financial close, within the next 12 months.
Okay, thank you. Ignacio, I'm not sure, do we have more time to go through the rest of these questions? I see we've only got 5 minutes left in today's session.
Well, I have no problem with that. So please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so this is from Martin. Martin says, there is limited capacity building for IPTs on the continent. Public officials need to understand the issues around IP-wise, perhaps it's IPTs, in order to support them as a viable model for developing infrastructure. My question is whether there are any training programs for both the private and public sectors in this area. I'm not sure if Ignacio, if you would like to answer that, or Chris. Sorry, Chris looks like he's got his hand up.
Sorry, I'll let Ignacio go as well, because I think Ignacio will certainly have something he'd like to say on this. I just wanted to make the point, I think capacity building is important, and I mentioned that in my previous comments. But what I will say is that if you use a relatively narrow form of PPP, like an ITP structure, the majority of sectors that have an IPP track record will be able to get their head around a lot of the structuring and a lot of the regulation that's used for a transmission project, because the concepts are very similar. The implementation agreements or the government support arrangements should be very similar. Mashoud in his comments talked about having a TSA. I mean, there's a lot that you can get from a PPA if you're negotiating a TSA in terms of basic concepts. The infrastructure is different, but the risk apportionments can be very similar. So I think we should start from the basis of saying that there's a lot that can be replicated from experience in countries with an IPP track record already, and then there's some additional capacity building that's required. And some of that is capacity building, it's training. But I think for me, the biggest bottleneck at the moment, not wanting to undersell the importance of training, and if Ignacio will say something this shortly, but the biggest bottleneck is actually just capacity to transact in things like transmission utility companies and regulators, because there's a certain number of projects on the go in the country at the moment. And if you open up the sector to a new form of financing, you just need more people with transactional experience who can be the interface with developers. And the transmission utilities just haven't had the investment in them necessary in order to do that to any great extent at the moment.
Well, what I could say from the African School of Regulation is that it is clear that this is a major problem, and that if we are the African School of Regulation, we will have to provide capacity building on this. And you are I think that the best experts that we could have find, right? So we will call you to organize such a course.
That's a good answer. Okay, let's have a question here from Heritier. A strong regulatory environment is still required to encourage private investment in electricity and transmission in Africa. Knowing that transmission involves multiple countries, how do we overcome countries' regulatory restrictions, barriers to make transmission more effective? Toela, you were talking about this issue earlier. Have you got any suggestions? How can we align regulation?
Well, I mean, I think we're on that. We are on that path. I mean, when you look at the whole premise of AFSAM, I think it's trying to get us to that point where we are able to harmonize and standardize. But I think, as I said, that we sort of have to figure out the path and the route to that. So currently, I think, de facto is that we are building on what's already happening in the regions, and trying to sort of understand what's the best of what's happening in the regions, and how do we take the best of what's happening and use that to influence and shape the continental approaches. But I think it's always going to come down to the fact that regions will not move at the same speed. And we have to sort of also factor that into the planning. And you'll see in the master plan that the master plan actually does show the fact that it will take a number of iterations before we achieve full integration. So some power pools are ready and they will fully integrate much sooner than others. And we know that for some regions, it will take longer for them to sort of ramp up. But I think the important thing is to really agree on the processes, to really agree on what it's going to take in terms of this integration. There's a proposal, for instance, for an independent continental regulator. How do we get from where we are now to having that continental regulator? And what does it mean when we have a continental regulator for the energy sector? So we're getting there, but I think maybe our biggest challenge is always the fact that time is never on our side, and we have to learn how to do things maybe faster and learn by doing, and fall and fail while we do it, but ultimately knowing that that falling and that failing is going to get us eventually to success.
Mark, if I may, let me say something about this. I've been involved in the project that joined the 6 countries in the Central America ISTM. And I was the advisor to the governments and provided the basic ideas to how to approach this CEPAC line of 1,800 kilometers joining the 6 countries. And I've been also involved in it's not 54, but it is 27 countries in European Union also involved that when I was a regulator. And I think that the steps, we have to separate the steps. So we have to define the project. And to define the project the way ITP is doing. So it is a project with so many assets that cost so much. Then you have to establish a separate company, as Ryan was saying. This is what we did with an SPV in Central America. Not needed really in Europe. In Europe is basically the agreement between the regulators. But let's assume that the more complex case in which you have a separate company, that separate company, as Ryan was saying, has to determine the service contract with each one of the countries. Then there is the critical issue of allocating the cost to each one of the countries. You don't need harmonization. You only need to say this country pays 15%, this 20, this 7, this 40, this so much, and adds up to 100, obviously. And that is an agreement that could be obtained by negotiation or could be obtained by some method to do it. Once you have the percentages, it is up to each country how to recover that money. Could be ring-fenced, doing whatever, but you don't need harmonization. You just need, it's much simpler than harmonizing the regulatory regimes, is to agree on the percentages for each one.
I'd just like to endorse that view, Ignacio. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think if you wait for regulatory perfection and harmonization, we'll end up with a very significant infrastructure deficit. We already have an infrastructure deficit. One lesson for us in looking at different markets from a regulatory perspective, when we want to go and work there and do transmission projects, is that most markets on the continent have suitable regulation at present, usually through their Electricity Act and a combination of that and perhaps the local PPP Act as well. And it doesn't always make very specific provision for transmission projects, but it's normally permissive. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't lots of difficult questions you have to ask a regulator when you go and sit before them, and that you don't have to agree some of the processes and some of the principles. And it's not to say that the regulation couldn't be significantly improved. But in most markets that have had an IPP in the past on the continent, you can start a transmission project and there's a route through it. And I think the important thing is to start projects and learn lessons as a sector and as a regulator on the way through them to improve the regulation rather than trying to perfect it before you do anything.
Yeah, it's interesting what you've brought up. I'm just reminded of a project called the Zizabona project, which is an interconnector which was supposed to be developed between Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, and Southern Africa. And they've tried to develop this project since 2008, and it's basically failed because of this negotiation that you were talking about, Ignacio, where they failed, and which Tawela also mentioned earlier, where somebody's a winner and somebody's a loser, you know, and how much people pay becomes the issue around which they can't agree you know, to develop the project. They're not sure how much everybody should have to pay for that line. So,
Well, if you give me a couple of hours, I will explain how to do it so that everybody wins.
okay. Okay, good. Hopefully we'll go forward then. Anyway, there's no more questions in the Q&A, so I think that's it from the panel. Thank you very much to African School of Regulation and GridWorks and all the other sponsors, and to the panelists. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow at the same time for the solutions.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.